Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Parallel Reels channel. If you're new here, please consider hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like if you enjoy the content. Today, we are going to be discussing the drama film Pacarku Dominan Dan Liar. The narrative unfolds around a young woman whose life takes a sharp turn after encountering a man who embodies a raw, untamed masculinity. Initially drawn in by his magnetic presence, she finds herself navigating a relationship characterized by intense control and passionate unpredictability, echoing perhaps the very visceral, unfiltered emotions often explored in independent cinema, far removed from glossy mainstream productions. Her background suggests a quieter existence, perhaps one where expectations of conformity still held sway, making the sheer force of his personality all the more disruptive. He, on the other hand, seems to carry the weight of a demanding, perhaps artistic or high-pressure career, the kind that breeds a need for absolute authority in his personal sphere. One can imagine him working in a field where precision and dominance translate directly into success, be it in high finance or the cutthroat world of competitive sports management, an environment that cultivates a certain ruthlessness. The drama hinges on the erosion of her boundaries. What begins as exciting, a thrilling dance on the edge of propriety, slowly morphs into something suffocating. The film carefully details the subtle ways his dominance manifests, not always through overt aggression, but through manipulative subtleties, the constant need to be the center of her universe, dictating her choices, her associations, even her thoughts. This mirrors the often unspoken power dynamics seen in narratives where one partner possesses a more established or forceful public persona, leveraging that external success inward. There are moments of intense tenderness, brief respites where the mask of the controlling figure slips, revealing a vulnerability that both reassures her and keeps her deeply entangled. These flashes serve as the necessary emotional tether, ensuring she doesn't simply walk away, much like the subtle character development often required in dramas that delve into complex psychological attachments. The inspiration for his intensity might stem from a deeply ingrained fear of abandonment or failure, projecting that anxiety onto the need to control his partner absolutely. As the pressure mounts, her own nascent strength begins to push back, fueled by an awakening to her own identity, something perhaps long suppressed by the demands of the relationship. This internal struggle is portrayed through quiet acts of defiance, a postponed meeting, an unapproved conversation, small tremors preceding a significant shift. The resolution, when it finally arrives, is less about a clean break and more about a hard-won understanding of self, achieved only after surviving the crucible of an overwhelmingly dominant force. The lingering feeling is that while the intensity may have subsided, the imprint of that raw, wild relationship will forever inform how she views desire and control in her future. The texture of their interactions is relentlessly consuming. We see her initially mistaking his intensity for profound passion, a common misinterpretation when one is starved for genuine connection. He, perhaps a man whose professional life demands meticulous execution, maybe a leading architect known for monolithic, imposing structures, or a film director whose vision allows no deviation, brings that same rigid framework into their shared apartment. His control isn't just about where she goes, it's about the very atmosphere of their home, a space that slowly ceases to feel like hers. Her emotional landscape shifts from vibrant anticipation to constant low-grade anxiety. Imagine her once filled with aspirations. Perhaps she was a promising junior editor, or a dedicated teacher whose patience was her strength, now finding that patience constantly tested, redirected toward placating his moods. The film excels at showing these small degradations, a smile that falters when he enters the room, the habitual checking of her phone to ensure no message has escaped his notice, the way her voice softens unnaturally when addressing him. His allure, the reason she remains tethered, resides in the sheer force of his charisma when he chooses to deploy it. These moments are intoxicatingly powerful, reminiscent of a tempestuous sea suddenly calming to glass, offering breathtaking reflections before the next storm hits. This cyclical nature mirrors the addictive qualities often observed in high-stakes environments. The risk becomes part of the reward. When he praises her, it feels earned like a difficult promotion, a validation so potent that it outweighs the days spent feeling invisible under his scrutiny. There are subtle hints at his own internal landscape, maybe glimpsed during moments when he is deeply engrossed in his work. A fleeting expression of profound loneliness, or a strained jawline suggesting that his dominance is as much a defense mechanism as a preference. Perhaps his own rise to prominence was fraught with betrayal or perceived slights, leading him to believe that vulnerability is equivalent to surrender. This psychological underpinning adds necessary depth, preventing him from becoming a mere caricature of a strong man, grounding his behavior in a recognizable, albeit toxic, form of self-protection. The pivot point often involves an external catalyst, a friend who gently questions her choices, or perhaps a professional success of hers that he subtly undermines, viewing her independent achievement as a threat to his singular dominance. This external pressure forces her to confront the gap between the man she idealized and the man who dictates her reality. The ensuing confrontation is not necessarily loud. Often, in dramas of this psychological intensity, the most profound ruptures happen in silence, in the deliberate refusal to meet his gaze, in the quiet act of reclaiming a piece of her own schedule, a decision made purely for herself, without seeking his prior approval. It is in these small, resolute affirmations of self that the narrative finds its truest, most resonant strength. The emotional toll of this constrained existence begins to manifest physically in her. We observe a subtle tension in her shoulders, the perpetual slight hunch that speaks of bracing for an unseen impact. She might have once been known for her easy laughter, perhaps a reflection of a nurturing profession like a pediatric nurse or a teacher who specialized in fostering creativity, but that lightness has been replaced by a practiced neutrality, a shell worn to deflect scrutiny. Her clothing might subtly change, becoming less expressive, more muted, an unconscious attempt to blend into the background and avoid registering on his radar unnecessarily. He, the dominant figure, likely operates in a realm where perception is currency, a sought-after brand strategist, or a high-profile gallery owner whose reputation precedes him. His inspiration comes not just from success, but from imposing his worldview onto others. His passion, when directed at her, is frighteningly specific. He doesn't just want her to be with him, he wants to architect the very best version of her, according to his exacting, unshared blueprint. This is where the danger truly lies, in the seductive promise of perfection achieved through compliance. There is a scene, perhaps, where she attempts a small, independent venture, maybe starting an online portfolio for her latent photography skills or volunteering for a cause she deeply believes in. His reaction is never explosive rage, but something far more insidious. Professional dismissal veiled as concern. He might critique the structure of her website with surgical precision, or gently suggest the charity is too common, subtly draining the energy from her endeavor until it dissolves back into the comfortable void of non-confrontation. This intellectual dismantling is often more crippling than a shout. The moments where she recalls her previous life, her independent friendships, the easy confidence she held before him, are portrayed not with tearful regret, but with a quiet, steely resolve hardening behind her eyes. This transformation from passive subject to nascent revolutionary is the core of her arc. It's the realization that the intensity she initially craved was merely a mirror reflecting his own unmanaged internal chaos, and that true strength lies not in surviving his storms, but in choosing a stable, self-owned shore. The narrative emphasizes that reclaiming autonomy is a slow, painstaking process of small, deliberate acts of self-trust, a quiet rebellion waged entirely within the confines of her own will, leading ultimately to an independence that is earned through survival. The air around them is thick with unspoken rules, a climate she has learned to breathe only superficially. Her past life, perhaps one involving the structured yet rewarding world of pharmaceutical research, where meticulous attention to detail was paramount, now seems like a quaint, almost naive memory. She once navigated complex chemical interactions. Now, she navigates the volatile terrain of his moods. Her former colleagues might remember her for her quiet brilliance, a steady hand in the lab, traits that are now actively suppressed lest they suggest a competency that rivals his own. His career, whether in high-stakes corporate law or as a renowned conductor whose baton controls entire orchestras, instills in him a profound belief in hierarchy. For him, the world is divided into those who lead and those who follow, and he positions himself immovably at the apex of their personal structure. His inspiration seems drawn from a need to impose order on anything that seems too wild or unpredictable, a psychological compulsion that manifests as a need to curate her every facet, from the books she reads to the music she listens to, often replacing her familiar comforts with his own favored, more severe artistic tastes. The emotional texture of their shared life becomes increasingly one-sided. We see her developing a kind of hyper-vigilance, an internal clock ticking constantly against the possibility of transgression. She learns the nuances of his silence, a short, sharp silence indicating disapproval, a drawn-out, hollow silence signifying withdrawal of affection. This constant state of readiness drains her reserves, leaving her emotionally threadbare even when she manages to meet his immediate demands. It is the fatigue of perpetually acting in a role written for someone else. When tenderness surfaces, it is often heavily weighted with possessiveness. He might present her with an extravagant gift, a piece of jewelry or a spontaneous trip, but these gestures are always framed as affirmations of ownership rather than simple generosity. These moments are designed to flood her with gratitude, momentarily washing away the memory of the previous restrictive days, functioning as emotional currency to buy her continued compliance. The film subtly suggests that his inspiration for these displays comes from a deep-seated insecurity. Control is the only reliable mechanism he possesses to feel secure in a world he perceives as inherently chaotic. Her slow awakening is marked by her reclaiming small physical spaces and private moments. Perhaps she begins taking solitary walks in a direction he has not explicitly sanctioned, or she reserves a single drawer in a desk for letters she writes but never sends. These small sanctuaries of self are vital, representing the quiet revolution occurring within her. The narrative builds toward the realization that true partnership cannot be built on the foundation of one person's total submission. Her journey is defined by recognizing that her own inherent worth is not contingent upon his volatile approval. The eventual separation, or the establishment of new, hard-won boundaries, is depicted not as a sudden explosion, but as the slow, deliberate freezing over of a passionate, yet ultimately unsustainable fire. The film deepens its exploration as her self-reclamation forces him into a corner where his usual tools of manipulation begin to fail. When she stops anticipating his needs and starts prioritizing her own quiet necessities, a regular meditation practice perhaps, or dedicating an hour a day solely to developing a skill he has always belittled, his frustration manifests as a chilling, almost academic coldness. He ceases the grand gestures and the passionate reconciliations, recognizing that the currency of affection is no longer effective. This new stage of conflict showcases his professional background in a stark light. If he cannot dominate through emotional force, he attempts to dominate through rational dismantling. He might employ the same rigorous, evidence-based scrutiny he likely applies in his career, say, as a highly successful venture capitalist analyzing a flawed investment, to critique her newfound independence. He points out statistical improbabilities for her success, uses flawless logic to undermine her emotional choices, framing her pursuit of autonomy as a regression into childish self-indulgence. This intellectual assault is designed to make her doubt the very stability of her own perception, making her feel like the unstable variable in their otherwise perfectly ordered system. Her emotional response is no longer simple fear, but a quiet, almost clinical observation of his tactics. Having lived so close to the furnace of his personality, She has become an expert in reading the subtle shifts in his demeanor, much like a seasoned diplomat learns to read the subtle inflections of an adversary. She sees the panic beneath the composed exterior, the sheer terror that his perfectly constructed world might admit the possibility of an independent, thriving entity that does not orbit him. This recognition, that his dominance stems from weakness, not inherent strength, is perhaps her most potent weapon. The climax of their struggle often avoids a dramatic physical altercation, instead centering on a quiet, defining moment of shared space where she refuses to yield ground he presumes is his. Imagine a scenario where he expects her to cancel an engagement for him, perhaps a crucial dinner where she needs to network, a skill he's always deemed beneath her. She maintains her commitment, not with defiance shouted across a room, but with the simple, unwavering act of putting on her coat and leaving the house while he is still speaking. The sound of the closing door carries more weight than any shouting match, signaling a permanent shift in the power dynamic, a boundary that has been permanently redrawn by her own internal compass finally aligning. The residue of the relationship, the film suggests, is not bitterness, but a profound, hard-won understanding of the difference between passionate attachment and authentic partnership. The aftermath of that definitive departure, or the establishment of those unyielding boundaries, becomes a study in psychological recovery. Her initial freedom is not immediately joyous. Rather, it is laced with a residual hyper-awareness, the phantom limb sensation of having an ever-present controller. She might find herself pausing before making even trivial decisions. What to order for lunch, which route to take home, a habit deeply ingrained from years of preemptive self-censorship. For someone perhaps transitioning from a career where creativity was encouraged but ultimately contained, like a graphic designer working within rigid corporate branding guidelines, this unstructured autonomy feels momentarily vast and overwhelming. He, conversely, struggles not with loss in the traditional sense, but with the collapse of his carefully curated narrative. His reaction, when visible, is a calculated attempt at re-engagement, not out of genuine remorse, but to prove the stability of his control mechanism. He might deploy the ghost of their intense passion, a carefully worded email citing an old shared memory, an acknowledgement of a vulnerability he once shared, aimed precisely at triggering her established emotional anchors. His expertise, perhaps as a highly successful commodities trader who thrives on market volatility, makes him adept at predicting and exploiting weak points in any system, including hers. The film beautifully illustrates her slow process of deprogramming. She begins intentionally cultivating environments he would have despised, embracing loud, unrefined music, inviting back the friends he had subtly alienated, allowing her living space to become slightly messy, a visual representation of internal peace over external perfection. These acts are quiet affirmations of self-sovereignty. We see her rediscovering her own authentic voice, perhaps beginning to mentor younger professionals, a role that requires clear, directive guidance, the antithesis of the ambiguous emotional landscape she previously inhabited. This mentoring role allows her to use her accrued difficult wisdom constructively, turning the pain into professional advantage. There are inevitable flashbacks, not of desire, but of moments where the manipulation was almost invisible, a conversation where he praised her ambition only after successfully steering it toward a path that benefited him. These recalled scenes function like cautionary tales, hardening her resolve. The essential truth illuminated by the narrative is that true dominance often wears the mask of deep investment. The most dangerous controlling partners are those who convince you that their authority is merely a reflection of their profound, specialized care for you. Ultimately, the film concludes not with a sense of triumphant victory, but with the profound quietude of survival. She has emerged scarred, certainly, but possessing an internal resilience forged in the crucible of absolute pressure. The wildness she once mistook for attractive masculinity is now clearly understood as chaos, and the stability she seeks is the hard-won peace of being solely responsible for her own emotional landscape, a landscape she is now finally free to design entirely for herself. The lasting impact of such an intense relationship manifests in her cautious approach to future intimacy. She no longer seeks the electrifying rush, recognizing it as a red flag indicating an imbalance of power rather than genuine connection. Her career, perhaps that of a journalist or investigative reporter known for thorough documentation and sourcing, benefits from this newfound skepticism. She is now less easily swayed by polished narratives and surface appearances. She applies the same rigorous cross-examination to potential partners that she once applied to dubious sources, demanding verifiable consistency between words and actions. He, isolated by his own uncompromising nature, might attempt to re-enter the public sphere where his dominance is undisputed, yet finds the victories hollow. If his career was rooted in public performance, like that of a celebrated stage actor whose entire persona relies on magnetic control over an audience, the absence of her focused attention leaves a gaping void. The film subtly implies that external success cannot compensate for the failure to maintain absolute control in the one area he deemed his ultimate domain, his personal life. His subsequent attempts at finding connection are clumsy, often defaulting to old patterns of testing boundaries, making him look increasingly out of sync with the world that has moved on. The emotional residue for her is a quiet vigilance, an understanding that vulnerability must be earned over vast stretches of demonstrated safety, not granted in the first passionate burst. She learns to value tedious consistency over spectacular volatility. There's a powerful scene where she witnesses an interaction mirroring her past relationship, perhaps a colleague being subtly undermined by a superior, and instead of retreating into silence, she intervenes with quiet, evidence-based clarity. This is the final proof of her transformation. She is now capable of protecting the boundaries of others because she has fiercely protected her own. The film suggests that the energy once consumed by managing his moods is now channeled entirely into building a self-sufficient existence. Her inspiration is now entirely internal. Success is measured by the internal quiet she can maintain, regardless of external pressures. The story ultimately moves beyond the dramatic confines of the relationship, settling into the long, slow work of integration. She doesn't just recover, she evolves, using the intense experience as a dark foundational lesson in recognizing true, sustainable strength, which, she realizes, resides not in dominance, but in self-possession. The narrative closes on a note of hard-won peace, the kind that comes after navigating a true psychological storm. The enduring shadow of that relationship subtly colors her professional interactions, making her acutely sensitive to power imbalances even in seemingly benign settings. If she pursued a career in international relations or diplomacy, where navigating hierarchical structures is constant, her past experience serves as an unintended training ground for recognizing veiled threats and subtle power plays. She can now detect the slightest tremor of manipulation in a negotiation before it fully materializes, a skill born from having lived within an environment where misreading a signal meant personal consequence. He, meanwhile, likely finds himself entangled in a different kind of chaos. His inability to accept anything less than total authority might see him clash repeatedly with peers or subordinates who possess their own spheres of influence. Perhaps he heads a creative agency where his genius is undeniable, but his ego is a persistent liability. The film might briefly revisit him in a moment of professional isolation, where his usual forceful charm fails to mend a bridge he has burned, suggesting that the very traits that fueled his professional ascent are the anchors dragging down his personal equilibrium. The wildness that once captivated her is now simply seen by others as unsustainable inflexibility. Her emotional world settles into a routine of deliberate self-care, where small acts of resistance become affirmations of her new reality. She might take up a physically demanding hobby, like rock climbing or marathon running, activities where the only person she needs to conquer is the slope or the distance itself. This physical manifestation of autonomy contrasts sharply with the suffocating inertia of her previous life. The exhilaration she now seeks is earned through measurable, solitary effort, replacing the borrowed, intoxicating highs provided by his volatile attention. There is a final, almost abstract confrontation, not face-to-face, but through the medium of their shared past, perhaps an unexpected convergence at a public event, or a mutual acquaintance mentioning his name. In these fleeting moments, she no longer feels the sharp sting of fear or the desperate pull of old attachment. Instead, there is a detached clarity, the cool assessment one gives to a historical event that shaped them, but no longer holds immediate sway. She sees him not as a lover, but as a necessary, albeit brutal, catalyst for her own becoming. The narrative concludes by emphasizing that the wildness she was initially drawn to was merely untamed need, whereas her current state is one of disciplined, self-directed strength. Her future is defined by the quiet confidence that she no longer needs a dominant figure to define her boundaries. She has drawn them herself, in indelible ink, through the sheer act of choosing her own peace over his turbulent passion. The long arc of recovery often involves shedding the remnants of the controlling partner's aesthetic preferences. If she was an academic, perhaps a historian specializing in marginalized voices, she slowly begins to reclaim the intellectual spaces he had deemed frivolous or unworthy of serious pursuit. Her reading list expands beyond the narrow confines of the philosophy he admired. She dives back into the rich, complex histories that speak to resilience against systemic pressure. This reclamation is quiet but vital, a decolonization of her own mind. His path, conversely, appears increasingly insular. Should he be portrayed as a self-made real estate mogul, whose inspiration derived from conquering territory, his isolation becomes palpable. He might continue to amass assets, but the thrill fades when there is no one whose approval he can subsequently demand or manipulate. The film might show a brief, uncomfortable moment where he tries to project his intensity onto a new companion, only to find the reaction is either timid compliance devoid of the spark he craved, or outright resistance that he no longer possesses the nuanced tools to manage effectively. His raw dominance, once so potent, is now merely crude. Her emotional maturity is demonstrated through an unexpected capacity for forgiveness, not toward him, but toward the younger version of herself who was seduced by surface intensity. This self-compassion is the final antidote to the shame he often fostered. When dealing with challenges in her career, perhaps launching an independent consultancy where she sets all the terms, she faces setbacks with the grounded patience of someone who has already survived the worst. She understands that failure is merely data, not a definition of her self-worth, a concept he tried vehemently to erase. The film leaves the audience with the understanding that the relationship was a strange, intense form of apprenticeship in self-awareness. She learned what she would not tolerate through the searing experience of accepting too much. The final lingering image is not of him, but of her, fully present in her own life, perhaps working late, immersed in a project she chose, illuminated by the steady, self-generated light of her own ambition. The wildness she sought has been transmuted into resilience, a strength that requires no audience and no external validation to exist. The very structure of her days now reflects an internalized commitment to authenticity, a stark contrast to the constant performance demanded by him. If her profession involves creative problem-solving, such as developing educational software, she prioritizes user experience and genuine utility over the kind of flashy, over-engineered solutions he would have championed simply to impress a competitor. Her focus is on depth and sustainability, qualities antithetical to the volatile, immediate gratification he pursued. This shift is reflected in her interactions with others. She offers encouragement based on demonstrated effort rather than relying on broad, superficial praise. He, in his continued pursuit of dominance, likely finds himself repeating cycles, perhaps trying to exert control over investments or personnel with increasing severity, only to face burnout or unexpected rebellion. The film hints that his need for control stems from an underlying fear of irrelevance, a terror that should he stop imposing his will, he will simply cease to matter. This insecurity might manifest in erratic behavior in his professional sphere, sudden, costly changes of direction, or an inability to delegate effectively because he cannot trust any variable outside his direct oversight. His career, once his fortress, becomes the arena where his greatest vulnerabilities are most visible. For her, healing involves a conscious embrace of the mundane aspects of life that he always dismissed as trivial. Cooking simple, nourishing meals, maintaining steady routines, investing in reliable, comfortable friendships. These are the acts of grounding that rebuild a sense of safety. The intensity she once associated with love has been recategorized as danger. True connection, she discovers, resides in the quiet space where two people can coexist without needing to actively manage or conquer the other's emotional landscape. Her inspiration is now drawn from the slow accumulation of personal victories, each one a brick in the foundation of her self-sovereignty. The final narrative resonance lies in her complete disengagement from his orbit. There is no dramatic closure where he acknowledges his fault. Such an admission would violate the core of his constructed persona. Instead, there is simply an irrelevance. When news of his professional setbacks or personal dramas eventually filters back to her, perhaps through mutual acquaintances, she processes it with the same emotional detachment she would give to reading a historical footnote. The wildness she once mistook for passion has been recognized for what it was, a destructive force that ultimately cleared the ground for a more durable, self-directed life. Her journey is less about escaping him, and more about completely constructing a world where his gravitational pull no longer exists. The final evolution in her character is marked by a profound understanding that true strength lies not in aggressive confrontation, but in the quiet act of refusing to participate in someone else's narrative. If her profession involved archival work or conservation, she would now treat her own personal history with the same meticulous care, preserving the lessons learned while discarding the toxic residue. She understands that the control he exerted was fundamentally parasitic, feeding on her willingness to sacrifice her own reality for the illusion of his grand passion. His attempts to maintain relevance become increasingly transparent and pathetic, often taking the form of grand public pronouncements or overly aggressive business maneuvers that lack the finesse of his earlier successes. The film might show him attempting to dominate a boardroom with the same dictatorial tone he once used in their private life, only to find that the modern professional landscape demands collaboration, not subjugation. His inspiration, once rooted in overcoming obstacles, has devolved into a desperate attempt to freeze time, refusing to acknowledge that the world, and she, have moved on. For her, the most significant emotional territory reclaimed is her sense of humor. The practiced neutrality dissipates, replaced by a genuine, often wry amusement derived from recognizing the absurdity of her past captivity. This levity is a true sign of healing, as humor requires a distance from pain that anxiety simply forbids. She can now engage in complex personal relationships, with friends, potential new partners, without the constant internal monologue checking for hidden demands or potential traps. Her capacity for trust is rebuilt slowly, brick by measured brick, based only on sustained, reciprocal respect. The film avoids a simplistic happily ever after ending. Instead, it offers something far more resonant, enduring capability. She is not cured of every lingering weariness, but she is equipped. The wildness that drew her in was external chaos. The strength she now possesses is entirely internal and cultivated. The closing moments often focus on her in a moment of solitary concentration, perhaps leading a complex project, or simply enjoying an unhurried morning. A testament to the fact that the most dominant force in her life is now her own unwavering will to live authentically. The control has shifted, not to another person, but decisively and permanently to herself. The narrative pivots to the subtle, often unrecognized ways that ingrained control mechanisms can manifest even when the primary source of pressure is removed. She finds herself exhibiting hypercompetence in areas that once brought her joy, a tendency born from the need to be unimpeachable, to leave no room for critique. For instance, if she took up painting again, the canvases might initially be flawless in technique, almost academically perfect, but lacking a certain necessary rawness or emotional spillover. This is the final internalized layer of his influence, the need for perfection as a shield against perceived attack, even when no attack is forthcoming. He, in his crumbling empire of control, might find himself drawn to individuals who mirror her past self, intense, ambitious, perhaps emotionally starved, and the cycle repeats, though with diminishing returns. He cannot replicate the specific chemistry of their shared intensity, only the formula of dominance. The film frames these repetitions not as villainy, but as a tragic inability to evolve. He is perpetually stuck in the operational logic of his own perceived threat matrix. His charisma, once a dazzling lure, now appears brittle and desperate, failing to hold the attention of those whose independence he cannot easily crush. Her true breakthrough arrives when she deliberately introduces imperfection into her meticulously ordered life, embracing the messy vitality of human endeavor. This might involve purposefully leaving a small, visible flaw in a final presentation, or engaging in a deeply vulnerable conversation where she admits a genuine lack of knowledge on a subject. In these moments of authentic imperfection, she discovers true connection with others, colleagues who respect her honesty more than her flawless execution, new friends who value her presence over her performance. This is the realization that vulnerability is the true currency of genuine intimacy, the exact inverse of the economy in which he operated. The final thematic statement revolves around the concept of self-authorship. She is no longer reacting to his structure. She is writing her own script, scene by painstaking scene. The memory of him fades from being a dominant force to a footnote, a difficult chapter that provided harsh, undeniable clarity about her own non-negotiable requirements for life. The film concludes not with a final confrontation or a dramatic reunion, but with her simply choosing her own path, walking away from the possibility of engagement with a calm certainty that is more powerful than any declaration of independence she could have made years prior. The quiet confidence in her step signals the end of the story of them, and the beginning of the enduring story of her. The lingering echoes of his control become most apparent in her dreams, which are no longer nightmares of confrontation, but subtle anxieties about internal order. She might dream of meticulously organizing vast libraries, only to discover that every book spine is subtly misaligned by a hair's breadth. A persistent visual anxiety mirroring the subtle, nagging feeling that something is always slightly wrong in her personal universe, even when outwardly everything is perfect. Her personal sanctuary, perhaps a converted attic space where she finally dedicates herself to intricate artisanal crafts, like watchmaking or fine bookbinding, becomes the battleground for this internalized perfectionism. The slightest slip of the hand, the tiniest scratch on the polished brass, can momentarily trigger the familiar, tightening sensation of anticipated censure. He, adrift in his self-imposed rigidity, might attempt to weaponize nostalgia against the few remaining connections he has. He doesn't seek her out directly, as that would imply a loss of status, but he might send oblique, highly curated messages to mutual acquaintances, painting a picture of his own profound, misunderstood suffering, hoping the narrative of his tragic genius will reach her and subtly undermine her new peace. If his former sphere was high finance, his distress manifests as recklessness, leveraging his remaining assets on high-risk ventures, seeking the adrenaline rush of potential collapse, only to stave off the gnawing emptiness of insignificance. He mistakes volatility for vitality. Her response to these ambient attempts at emotional intrusion is characterized by a gentle, almost clinical detachment. She engages with the outside world, her community, her chosen colleagues, with a newfound, authentic generosity that lacks any trace of transactionality. She mentors a younger colleague, not because it reflects well on her, but because the transfer of genuine knowledge is its own reward. This consistent demonstration of unconditional positive regard contrasts sharply with the conditional acceptance she once received. and she begins to recognize this unconditional space as the true marker of healthy relationships. The ultimate scene of her complete emancipation is almost mundane, yet profoundly significant. She is perhaps in a bustling public market, surrounded by noise and chaotic energy, moments he would have found unbearable and chaotic. She pauses, not out of vigilance, but simply to appreciate the sensory overload, the smell of spices, the cacophony of negotiation. A stranger bumps into her, an accidental collision that would have once sent her into a defensive posture. But this time, she simply steadies herself, offers a small, genuine smile, and moves on. There is no internal accounting, no fear of retribution. The moment signifies the final, quiet victory. The absolute certainty that her physical space and emotional boundaries are entirely her own to manage, without apology or explanation. The wildness is gone, replaced by an unshakable internal foundation built on the bedrock of self-trust. The final phase of her journey is marked by a nuanced understanding of her own capacity for passion, now tempered by the wisdom of experience. The dazzling intensity she once mistook for connection is now viewed with the clarity of a scientist analyzing a toxic compound. Her attraction, should it re-emerge in a new relationship, is drawn toward individuals whose strength is quiet and transparent, whose authority is earned through demonstrated integrity rather than projected entitlement. If she engages romantically again, it will be with someone whose own boundaries are so secure that they feel no compulsion to trespass upon hers. Her emotional language shifts from reaction to intention. He, meanwhile, is left to manage the fallout of his own design flaws. His professional landscape, once a testament to his singular vision, becomes littered with the wreckage of trusted alliances eroded by his unwavering need for command. The film might offer a fleeting glimpse of him in a setting where he is profoundly out of place. Perhaps an informal gathering where genuine camaraderie supersedes hierarchical posturing. He stands isolated, attempting to command attention with a presence that has curdled from magnetic to oppressive. The audience witnesses the realization, perhaps only through the stiff set of his shoulders, that while he can control variables, he cannot command affection or respect when it is not freely given. The internal architecture of her own being is now the focus of her artistry. Whether through her established career or a new creative endeavor, her work speaks to complexity, layered meaning, and the beauty found in asymmetry, the very things he tried to scrub away. There is a sense of profound relief in this messy creation. She finds satisfaction in the process, not just the perfect outcome. She is learning to inhabit her own contradictions, recognizing that the human experience thrives in the space between absolute control and utter abandon. This acceptance of her own inherent untidiness is the final undoing of his conditioning. The narrative concludes by refusing to grant him a dramatic reckoning or a moment of catharsis. His story continues outside her periphery, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time, irrelevant to her forward momentum. Her peace is not predicated on his failure, but on her successful reorientation of self. The final image may focus on her looking out over a wide, open landscape, not one she intends to conquer, but one she intends merely to inhabit fully. The wildness is no longer something to be subdued or avoided. It is the vast, beautiful, and ultimately manageable territory of her own self-determination. The true triumph is the silence where his expectations used to scream. The narrative unfolding in Pacarku Dominan Dan Liar presents a potent, if occasionally melodramatic, exploration of power dynamics within a romantic partnership, deeply rooted in the exploration of control and submission. The film operates within a familiar framework of intense, almost volatile relationships, often seen in contemporary Indonesian cinema, yet it attempts to inject a layer of psychological complexity regarding the boundaries of desire and autonomy. The central conflict hinges on the character dynamic established between the two protagonists, whose relationship is defined by an imbalance that leans heavily toward dominance. The portrayal of this dominance often borders on the oppressive, challenging the viewer to distinguish between genuine, passionate intensity and unhealthy control. Analyzing the performances is crucial here. The actor portraying the dominant partner, whose previous work perhaps hinted at roles requiring strong, unyielding screen presence, channels that energy directly into this relationship. Their commitment to the demanding physicality and emotional intensity required by the script elevates scenes that might otherwise feel purely exploitative, grounding the intensity in a believable, if highly charged, interpersonal chemistry. Conversely, the partner who accepts, or perhaps initially seeks out, the submissive role brings a nuanced fragility to the performance. This character's journey is less about asserting independence and more about navigating the emotional terrain carved out by the dominant figure. Drawing inspiration from archetypes exploring the allure of relinquishing control, a theme frequently explored in global cinema, dealing with intense romantic bonds, this performance manages to convey both the intoxicating nature of yielding power and the underlying vulnerability that such a concession entails. The actor's prior roles, perhaps in quieter, more introspective dramas, offer a subtle counterpoint to the overt aggression displayed by their counterpart. The film's visual language often reinforces this power structure. Cinematography frequently utilizes framing that visually diminishes the submissive partner, placing them in shadows or physically lower positions within the frame, while the dominant partner is often bathed in harsher, more direct light, suggesting transparency in their intent, however manipulative that intent might be. This visual metaphor is heavy-handed at times, serving as a blunt instrument rather than subtle suggestion, a common trait when filmmakers prioritize immediate emotional impact over nuanced pacing. One might look for inspiration drawn from specific global cinematic touchstones dealing with extreme romantic dependencies. While direct parallels are difficult to draw without specific director notes, the film echoes the high-stakes emotional temperature of certain European dramas that dissect erotic tension mixed with manipulation. Yet it filters this through a distinctly local lens regarding social expectations and relationship negotiation. The pacing accelerates sharply when the dominant partner's control is challenged, leading to dramatic confrontations that satisfy genre expectations for high emotional stakes, but sometimes sacrifice logical progression for heightened dramatic effect. Ultimately, Pacarku Dominan Dan Liar functions most effectively as a showcase for the actors navigating extreme emotional territory. It leaves the audience questioning the true nature of mutual consent within the volatile space it depicts, forcing a prolonged consideration of where fascination ends and genuine threat begins. The film doesn't necessarily resolve this tension cleanly, opting instead for an ending that suggests the cycle of dominance and yielding may continue, reflecting the endearing complexity of unbalanced intimacy. The emotional architecture of this relationship, as depicted, relies heavily on the unspoken agreements and transgressions that characterize a severely unbalanced power dynamic. The dominant figure, in their pursuit of absolute control, reveals layers of insecurity masked by outward aggression. Their wildness, as suggested by the title, is not simply untamed passion, but rather a manifestation of profound internal chaos that they seek to externalize and impose upon their partner. We see glimpses of this desperation in moments when their control wavers, a flicker of panic in the eyes when the submissive partner shows genuine independence, suggesting that their entire sense of self is tethered to maintaining the upper hand. The actor delivering this performance likely draws on a well of experience portraying characters wrestling with internal demons, transforming that internal battle into externalized relationship demands. The recipient of this dominance, conversely, exhibits a fascinating duality. There are moments where their compliance appears genuinely unsettling, suggesting a deep-seated need to be directed, perhaps stemming from a fear of personal decision-making or a prior history where external guidance was a source of perceived safety. However, the most compelling moments occur when the veneer of submission cracks, revealing sharp intelligence and a hidden capacity for manipulation within their own realm of surrender. This character isn't merely a passive victim, They are an active participant whose primary tool of agency becomes the very act of yielding. If the actor's previous roles involved characters navigating complex social constraints, this performance allows them to explore the strategic use of perceived weakness as a form of defense and, potentially, an insidious form of attack against the relationship's primary aggressor. The setting often mirrors the internal claustrophobia experienced by the characters. Interiors tend to feel opulent, yet suffocating. Spaces designed for comfort that quickly become gilded cages, reflecting the dominant partner's desire to possess and control the environment around their lover. This visual reinforcement supports the film's exploration of intimacy as a form of territorial claim. When the couple is outside, the framing often emphasizes their isolation from societal norms. They exist in a bubble where conventional rules of partnership do not apply, further solidifying the insular, intense nature of their bond. The emotional crescendo of the film is not necessarily marked by physical conflict, though those moments certainly punctuate the drama, but by the subtle shifts in psychological leverage. A single look held too long, a carefully chosen word that undermines the partner's self-worth, or, conversely, a moment of genuine, unexpected tenderness from the dominant character. These tiny gestures carry immense weight. They are the emotional currency of this high-stakes game, constantly fluctuating between validation and destruction. The film forces us to observe how quickly affection can be weaponized and how deeply embedded the desire for intense connection, even painful connection, can become within the human psyche. The lingering feeling after viewing is not just one of discomfort, but a recognition of the fine, often invisible line separating profound love from pathological entanglement. The film's exploration of the wild aspect, attributed to the dominant partner, suggests a rejection of societal norms regarding masculine presentation within a relationship context. This wildness is performed. It's an enacted freedom that only truly exists because the other partner grants tacit permission through their compliance. The dominant character's insistence on setting the boundaries, physical, emotional, and even temporal, reflects a deeply internalized performance of strength, perhaps inspired by cinematic portrayals of charismatic but ultimately destructive anti-heroes whose magnetism is directly proportional to their unpredictability. The actor's ability to maintain that unpredictability while still delivering moments of intense, almost vulnerable affection is what keeps the audience engaged, preventing the character from collapsing into a simple villain caricature. Their prior roles, perhaps leaning towards characters who commanded respect through sheer willpower in professional settings, now translate that boardroom authority into the domestic sphere. Treating the relationship itself as a negotiation they must always win. The emotional response elicited by the submissive character is more complex, moving beyond mere sympathy toward a fascination with their strategic endurance. This character embodies a kind of emotional asceticism, finding a strange liberation in the relinquishing of decision-making burdens. Their internal monologue, often implied through prolonged silence or highly expressive close-ups, suggests a character who is constantly calculating the cost-benefit of their compliance. The inspiration for this depth might come from literary sources where endurance itself is framed as a subtle form of power. When this partner finally does push back, it is never a grand, shouting confrontation. Instead, it manifests as a quiet withdrawal of affection or a calculated act of vulnerability that forces the dominant partner to momentarily step out of their controlling role to offer comfort. This momentary inversion of power is thrilling for the audience precisely because it is so fragile and easily rescinded. The dramatic structure builds towards an inevitable crisis where the established equilibrium, however toxic, must break. This breaking point is often triggered by an external element, a friend, a relative, or a professional obligation that forces the couple out of their insulated bubble, exposing the inherent imbalance to the scrutiny of the outside world. The dominant character's reaction to this external pressure is crucial. Do they aggressively protect their possession? Or does their control slip, revealing the hollowness beneath the dominance? The visual storytelling during these external confrontations often shifts. The previously claustrophobic interiors are replaced by vast, indifferent public spaces, where the couple suddenly appears small and awkwardly connected, emphasizing their reliance on each other when stripped of their controlled environment. The film ultimately suggests that in relationships defined by such intense, asymmetric power exchange, true freedom for either party remains elusive, perpetually trapped between the intoxicating pull of extreme attachment and the necessary boundary of self-preservation. The pacing of the film pivots subtly in its latter half, moving from sustained emotional tension to a more fragmented exploration of consequence. This shift is mirrored in the characters' external lives, suggesting that the intensity of their private world inevitably bleeds into their public responsibilities and careers. For the dominant partner, this unrestrained relational behavior might manifest as impatience or an inability to delegate in professional spheres, traits that perhaps previously endeared them as signs of passion, but now border on erraticism. The film avoids detailing career highs or lows explicitly, focusing instead on the emotional residue that their relationship leaves on their interactions with others. We understand their professional competence primarily through how much they are willing to risk or sacrifice for the sake of maintaining control at home. The relationship becomes the true center of gravity, pulling energy away from other pursuits. The submissive partner's re-entry, however cautious, into broader social engagement often presents the most fascinating dramatic opportunities. If this character had a less visible or more supportive career before the relationship fully took hold, perhaps something involving meticulous detail or behind-the-scenes work, their slow reassertion of self is characterized by small, almost accidental triumphs. A well-received project, a rediscovered friendship that demands honest appraisal of the past. These external affirmations serve as tiny anchors pulling them back toward personal autonomy. The actor here excels in conveying the profound exhaustion that comes from maintaining a sustained performance of compliance, showing the sheer energy expenditure required to constantly anticipate and manage another person's volatile moods. Their eventual path forward is rarely triumphant in a conventional sense. Rather, it is marked by a quiet, almost stubborn recalibration of their own internal compass, a slow process of learning to trust the sound of their own judgment over the loud, demanding voice of their former lover. The directorial choice regarding the score and sound design also plays a crucial role in framing this resolution phase. The initial sections were underscored by sweeping, intense orchestral movements, mirroring the lover's volatile passion. As the power dynamic begins to fracture, the music often recedes, replaced by moments of near silence punctuated only by diegetic sounds. The hum of a refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the crisp turn of a page. This sonic austerity forces the audience to focus on the stark reality the characters inhabit once the emotional drama subsides, emphasizing the mundane yet necessary task of rebuilding a life from the fragments left behind. It suggests that the true test of character is not surviving the storm, but navigating the quiet aftermath where self-definition must happen without the extreme stimulus of the previously dominant relationship. The final act leans heavily on ambiguity, refusing the neat closure often expected of melodrama, instead offering a tableau of ongoing psychological negotiation. The dominant figure, stripped of the immediate focused intensity of their partner's total attention, often appears diminished, their power now self-referential and brittle. The initial charisma that fueled their control seems to have evaporated, leaving behind a figure struggling to project authority in a vacuum. This late-stage vulnerability is key to the film's more mature moments. It suggests that the performance of dominance required an equal and unwavering performance of submission to sustain itself. When that support structure is withdrawn, the dominant character is forced into a confrontation, not with their partner, but with their own constructed identity, an internal reckoning that the camera observes with unflinching detachment. For the formerly submissive character, The evolution culminates not in dramatic revenge or complete escape, but in a quiet, profound act of self-possession. This might be symbolized by something small yet significant: making a decision without consulting anyone, choosing a piece of clothing that distinctly reflects their own taste, or simply taking up physical space unapologetically. The emotional landscape shifts from fear to a cautious curiosity about the self. The actor conveys this transformation through subtle shifts in posture, shoulders slightly squared, eyes engaging the camera directly rather than darting away. This final iteration of the character is an acknowledgement that power within a relationship is fluid, and even the most absolute submission contains the seeds of its own agency. Their journey serves as a commentary on the insidious ways control can be internalized, and the arduous, non-linear path required to reclaim one's narrative voice. The film's lasting impact resides in this refusal to offer a clear moral victory. It posits that in relationships of such profound imbalance, even separation leaves indelible marks. The final frames might show the two characters in separate spaces, yet their past connection lingers as a shadow over their present choices. The narrative suggests that the memory of such intense entanglement, the high highs and the devastating lows, becomes a permanent complex reference point against which all future intimacy will be measured. It is a mature, if unsettling, conclusion that acknowledges the devastating allure of obsession and the enduring difficulty of truly severing psychological bonds forged in extreme emotional proximity. The lingering ambiguity of the ending is precisely what elevates Pacarku Dominan Dan Liar beyond simple cautionary tale territory. It forces the audience to contend with the inherent human attraction to extremes, even destructive ones. The residual energy between the former lovers, palpable even in their separation, suggests that the dynamic was not merely a series of actions and reactions, but a co-created reality they both, on some fundamental level, required for a time. The dominant partner, now isolated, might cling to recollections of control as proof of their significance, desperately cataloging past moments of ascendancy to ward off the terrifying reality of their sudden ordinariness. Their wildness curdles into mere unpredictability without an audience to validate its theatricality. It becomes a lonely, self-consuming fire. For the character who has reclaimed their autonomy, the lingering emotion is not necessarily triumph, but a deep, perhaps weary understanding of human fallibility, including their own past complicity. The emotional scaffolding built around the expectation of being directed has been meticulously dismantled, a process that requires continuous vigilance against relapse. Any future romantic engagement will be viewed through the harsh, clarifying lens of this past experience. Moments of assertiveness from a new partner will be analyzed for signs of hidden control, while moments of shared vulnerability will be approached with a newfound, almost academic caution. The actor's future work might subtly reflect this newfound wariness, perhaps favoring roles where emotional commitment is built on transparency rather than charged intensity. Furthermore, the film subtly critiques the cultural context that perhaps enabled such an extreme dynamic. While the drama focuses intensely on the couple, the near-total absence of supportive or challenging external voices underscores how insulated such intense bonds can become, thriving in a vacuum of accountability. The societal expectations surrounding relationship roles, what constitutes appropriate passion, how submission is perceived, are implicitly interrogated. The liar aspect of the title might not solely refer to active deceit, but to the performance of happiness and normalcy required when living a relationship outside conventional parameters. In its final analysis, the film serves as a stark, unflinching portrait of how two individuals, perhaps seeking validation or escape through each other, can construct a world so consuming that dismantling it becomes as intense an act of survival as creating it was an act of mutual, albeit distorted, desire. The film's enduring resonance stems from its unflinching examination of how intimacy can become a site of profound psychological warfare, where affection and oppression are inextricably linked. The emotional residue left on the characters is not merely scarring, but formative. For the dominant individual, the loss of the relationship might lead to a desperate search for an analogous structure in new pursuits, perhaps channeling that intense need for control into hyper-focused ambition, or even self-destructive behaviors, lacking the external foil that once defined their existence. If their previous career trajectory involved leading large teams or projects, this newfound internal chaos might ironically lead to better, albeit more ruthlessly managed professional success, as they learn to control inanimate objectives rather than unpredictable human connection. The performance here ultimately becomes a cautionary study in arrested emotional development, where the refusal to mature manifests as tyranny within the closest relationship. The evolution of the submissive partner is perhaps the film's most resonant artistic achievement, moving them from an object of analysis to a nuanced survivor. Their journey towards self-definition is often characterized by a profound appreciation for the mundane, the simple pleasure of making an uncoerced choice about what to eat, wear, or read. This seemingly small reclamation of personal space speaks volumes about the gravity of what was lost and what has been regained. We see this in the characters' eventual relationship with the world. They are no longer seeking intensity as a substitute for authenticity. Instead, they gravitate towards stability, perhaps finding fulfillment in roles or friendships that emphasize mutual respect and slow, dependable growth. The actor portraying this resilience may find their future roles exploring themes of quiet strength, contrasting sharply with the volatile energy they mastered earlier in their career. Their final, unspoken message is that true power lies not in commanding others, but in the unwavering mastery of the self, a victory achieved not in a climactic confrontation, but in the quiet persistence of the everyday. The film, by leaving these threads deliberately frayed, invites the audience to complete the recovery process in their own minds, making the psychological impact both immediate and long-lasting. The film's final moments, devoid of explosive confrontations, settle into a muted atmosphere that demands introspection from the viewer regarding the nature of healing itself. True recovery, the narrative implies, is not signaled by a dramatic pronouncement of freedom, but by the quiet, almost invisible act of establishing new internal boundaries. The visual contrast between the two protagonists in the closing sequence, if they are shown separately, is telling. The dominant figure often inhabits spaces that feel too large, too empty, their previous insistence on owning every element of their environment, now turning the environment into a vast, unmanageable space reflecting their own internal void. Their former liar persona, sustained by the partner's belief, crumbles into visible anxiety, perhaps manifested in nervous habits or an inability to settle into any single activity, a direct consequence of having outsourced their emotional regulation for so long. Conversely, the submissive character's final tableau is characterized by a sense of earned stillness. This stillness is not the tense silence of fear, but the deep calm of someone who has finally learned the cadence of their own breath. The actor's final scenes might showcase a return to a former, simpler passion that was suppressed during the relationship. Perhaps a return to painting, writing, or a quiet dedication to a non-competitive professional field. This signifies a shift from deriving self-worth through the intensity of another person's gaze to finding value in self-generated creation and genuine connection. The inspiration for this quiet strength might be drawn from cinematic figures who achieve profound moral victories through steadfastness rather than overt action, demonstrating that the most significant battles are often fought and won internally, away from the glare of public drama. The film thus concludes not with a definitive answer about the viability of their relationship, but a sober meditation on the human cost of misplaced devotion and the arduous, unsung labor of self-restoration. The thematic resonance of this psychological drama is further amplified by its nuanced approach to memory and narrative ownership in the aftermath. For the dominant partner, the relationship risks being perpetually rewritten in their mind as a validation of their power, even in its absence. They may selectively recall moments of passion while editing out the oppressive control, creating a self-serving mythology of the union. This tendency to curate the past is a final, desperate assertion of dominance over reality itself. The actor portraying this role must master the subtle art of self-deception, allowing the audience to see the facade flicker, revealing the deep-seated fear that without an audience to their control, they cease to exist meaningfully. Their professional life, if it continues to thrive, becomes a sterile monument to a control they can no longer wield intimately. The journey of the formerly submissive character involves a necessary and often painful deconstruction of their own memories. They must actively wrestle back the narrative, separating moments of genuine affection, if any existed, from the conditioning of submission. This process is rarely linear. There will be moments of profound nostalgia for the intoxicating intensity, a recognition that even painful connection felt like something, contrasting sharply with the sometimes bland neutrality of a self-directed life. The film handles this internal conflict by showing brief, almost intrusive flashbacks, where the submissive partner's face registers confusion or even longing amidst their newfound peace. This suggests that healing is not about erasure, but integration, acknowledging the experience without allowing it to dictate future boundaries. The true measure of this character's liberation is the ability to look back without self-recrimination, understanding that their past compliance was a survival mechanism, not an inherent flaw. Ultimately, the film's power resides in its refusal to simplify the allure of the dominant submissive paradigm. It avoids heavy-handed didacticism, instead presenting a complex ecosystem where both participants are, in different ways, trapped by the imbalance. The wildness is revealed to be a performance of freedom for the controller, just as the submission was a performance of surrender for the controlled. When the music fades and the dramatic lighting shifts, what remains is the quiet, unsettling truth that some intense connections are so deeply woven into a person's identity that untangling them requires the creation of an entirely new self, a process as fraught with conflict as the original relationship itself. The quiet persistence of the submissive character in forging a new identity is often punctuated by moments of unexpected emotional turbulence, a delayed reaction to the years of emotional suppression. These are not dramatic breakdowns, but small instances where the conditioned reflexes resurface, a tendency to preemptively apologize, or an automatic deference to an unexpected suggestion from a casual acquaintance. The actor excels at depicting these micro-reversions, moments where the learned behavior surfaces like muscle memory, immediately followed by a visible process of self-correction. This internal dialogue, the ongoing negotiation between the old self and the emerging self, forms the true core of the film's latter half. It's a testament to the characters' resilience that they recognize these patterns as vestiges of the past, rather than defining traits of the present. Simultaneously, the dominant partner's narrative arc, though less focused on personal growth, provides a chilling counterpoint on the nature of arrested development. Their continued isolation suggests that the external structure of control was their only viable way of relating to the world. The dynamism they once commanded through raw emotional force now translates into erratic, disconnected actions. Perhaps we see them engaging in superficial relationships that mimic the intensity they once shared, but fail because the other party refuses to participate in the established power script. The inspiration for this character's trajectory could be seen in figures of historical obsession, whose relentless pursuit of control ultimately isolates them from genuine human warmth. The film suggests that without the mirror of a compliant partner, the dominant one is left staring into a void of their own making, a fate arguably more severe than the emotional reconstruction faced by the other. The film's aesthetic choice to conclude with such subdued imagery emphasizes the enduring influence of the relationship on the texture of daily life, rather than its grand narrative. The vibrant, saturated colors that define the passionate, volatile scenes have bled out, replaced by a palette of muted grays and earth tones that suggest realism, sobriety, and the slow pace of genuine recovery. This visual language avoids the cathartic release of a Hollywood ending, instead offering a more honest depiction of trauma's aftermath, a long, quiet process of re-education. The enduring tension lies in the possibility that the magnetic pull of that toxic intensity might, years later, tempt one or both characters back into a familiar orbit, illustrating that some emotional imprints are indelible, shaping future choices in ways both conscious and subconscious. The lingering question for the audience upon the film's conclusion is whether true transformation is possible when the foundation of one's identity has been so profoundly intertwined with another's domination. The submissive character's newfound quietude is compelling, but it is also fragile, constantly tested by the inertia of past habits. This fragility is subtly communicated in moments where they exhibit an almost painful level of self-awareness, scrutinizing every positive interaction for signs of hidden agenda. The actor portraying this transition masterfully conveys that regaining autonomy is not a destination, but a perpetual state of vigilance, a constant internal referendum on authenticity. Their victory is internal, often invisible to the outside world, which may only perceive them as having finally settled down after a period of drama. In contrast, the dominant figure's lingering presence, even in absence, is felt through the pervasive shadow they cast over the landscape of the other's memory. Their wildness, initially seen as a thrilling transgression, is ultimately exposed as a profound lack of internal structure. The film seems to argue that true dominance requires an external source of submission to define its own boundaries. Without it, the energy dissipates into meaningless turbulence. The actor's commitment to portraying this eventual deflation, the slow realization that their charisma was contingent, is what prevents the character from becoming a simple villain and instead renders them tragically stunted. Their professional successes become hollow echoes, accomplishments achieved in a realm where emotional manipulation is less effective than competence. The cinematography in these final sequences often frames the formerly dominant character in wide, almost empty shots, emphasizing isolation, while the reclaimed character is frequently shown in medium close-ups, engaged in focused, purposeful activity. This visual dialogue speaks volumes. One is defined by the negative space they create around themselves, the other by the concrete, self-directed space they inhabit. The film avoids explicit reconciliation or condemnation, instead offering a profound meditation on entropy in destructive relationships. It suggests that the most dramatic story is often not the spectacular collision, but the slow, painstaking process of two individuals learning to occupy space separately, carrying the heavy, indelible memory of what it felt like to be consumed by another. The film's exploration of memory extends beyond the characters' individual recollections into the very fabric of the cinematic language used to present their history. The use of fragmented flashbacks, which initially served to heighten the suspense surrounding the power dynamic, begins to shift in connotation. What once felt like exciting glimpses into forbidden territory now reads as documentary evidence of psychological erosion. These moments, often presented with high contrast and distorted sound, a favored technique in the film's first half to emphasize the dominant partner's subjective reality, are recontextualized. The audience recognizes that the intensity itself was a form of narrative control exerted by the relationship's architect. The submissive partner's relationship with these fragmented memories becomes the central challenge of their ongoing recovery. They are forced to become their own historian, meticulously piecing together a timeline where their own subjective experience was systematically undermined. This echoes the work of individuals recovering from trauma, who must learn to trust their own perception over the imposed version of events by an abuser. The actor conveys this intense mental labor through subtle facial expressions, a sudden clench of the jaw when recalling a specific boundary violation, immediately followed by a gentle, intentional release as they affirm their present reality. Their engagement with the past is not passive viewing, but active rehabilitation of their own timeline. Meanwhile, the dominant figure often appears incapable of engaging with their own past in a constructive manner. Their engagement with memory seems purely performative, reserved only for moments when they feel judged or when they seek to re-establish leverage over an acquaintance or a subordinate. They are trapped in a loop where every past success, every moment of perceived wildness, must be immediately validated externally, confirming that they never fully internalize the consequences of their actions. This stagnation becomes the ultimate confirmation of their emotional defeat. They possess the power to manipulate others, but they cannot manipulate their own past into something that offers genuine comfort or growth. The final unspoken agreement between the two, even in separation, is the shared, unspoken knowledge of the manufactured reality they once inhabited, a secret that forever marks the way they view the world and intimacy. The film subtly introduces an element of meta-narrative in its very final reflections, suggesting that the allure of this dynamic is deeply embedded in cultural archetypes, making the characters almost mythological representations of control and surrender. The dominant figure, in their attempts to move forward, may find themselves drawn to artistic or philosophical texts that justify hierarchical structures, seeking intellectual scaffolding for their innate need to command. This search is characterized by a brittle, academic intensity, a replacement of relational command with intellectual one-upmanship. The actor's performance here pivots away from physical magnetism to a cold, intellectual superiority, demonstrating that the need for control is so ingrained it simply finds a new, less emotionally taxing medium. The audience recognizes this as a defense mechanism. If they can conquer a theory, perhaps they can avoid confronting the messy reality of their own relational failures. For the survivor, the reclamation of narrative ownership leads to a surprising, almost defiant embrace of honesty, even in mundane settings. Where their past was defined by meticulously crafted omissions, their present is marked by a refreshing, perhaps occasionally reckless, candor. This might manifest in a new friendship, where they openly discuss the pitfalls of intensity, not for sympathy, but as a statement of fact about their own boundaries. This honesty acts as an antidote to the performative deceit that characterized their previous life. The emotional reward for this character is not external validation, but the internal resonance of congruence, the alignment between what they feel, what they say, and what they do. The subtle triumph is witnessing this character engaging in spontaneous, uncalculated kindness, a behavior utterly impossible when one is constantly calculating the cost of every gesture. The film's final enduring image often returns to a shared, yet distinct sense of melancholy that transcends mere regret. It is the melancholy of having glimpsed a profound level of connection, however toxic, and knowing that such intensity is unlikely to be replicated in a truly healthy dynamic. This acknowledgement is the shared burden of both protagonists. The dominant figure mourns the loss of the ultimate audience. The submissive mourns the intensity they mistook for love. The director wisely leaves the score almost entirely absent in the closing minutes, allowing the ambient sound, a distant siren, the gentle turning of a key in a lock, to underscore the final message. Life continues, stripped of the intoxicating, destructive drama, demanding a resilience built not on performance, but on quiet, sustained being. The film thus transcends the specific relationship to become an observation on the human condition's constant oscillation between the desire for absolute merging and the imperative of sovereign selfhood. The film's ultimate meditation resides in the enduring paradox that the most formative relationships are often the most destructive, leaving behind an indelible emotional dialect that colors all subsequent interactions. The narrative concludes not with closure, but with a lingering awareness of relational possibility and peril. The dominant partner, having exhausted the terrain of external control, faces the possibility of an internal reckoning, though the film offers no guarantee this will materialize. If they are seen in a final, brief professional context, perhaps addressing a boardroom or leading a project team. Their presence might be characterized by an unnerving smoothness, a perfected mask of competence that lacks the dangerous electricity of their past interactions. This veneer of control is now brittle, relying entirely on adherence to external rules, rather than the projection of personal will. The audience is left to project their own hopes or fears onto this figure. Will they ever evolve? Or are they condemned to an endless cycle of seeking substitutes for the unique validation their former partner provided? For the survivor, the final frames emphasize a deliberate, almost reverent cultivation of authenticity, often symbolized by an engagement with the natural world or a commitment to genuine community involvement, areas utterly antithetical to the manufactured drama of their past. This manifests not as a flight from intimacy, but as an informed caution. New connections are built slowly, brick by careful brick, based on verifiable consistency rather than charismatic surges. The actor's final performance might involve a moment of shared, uncomplicated laughter, a sound utterly distinct from the sharp, brittle laughter often provoked during the relationship. This genuine joy signifies a hard-won victory, the realization that emotional safety does not preclude profound connection. It merely demands a different lexicon for expressing passion. The director employs a final, lingering shot, perhaps the abandoned apartment, now stripped bare, to function as the relationship's epitaph. The echoes of conflict are gone. The physical space is neutral, yet the viewer feels the residual weight of the intensity that once saturated the very air. This emptiness confirms the film's central thesis, that the most potent forces shaping our adult lives are often the bonds we sever at great personal cost. Pacarku Dominan Dan Liar ultimately serves as a haunting cinematic footnote on the difference between intensity and substance, leaving the audience with the unsettling understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love one can perform for oneself is the unwavering commitment to walking away from a perfectly constructed, yet fundamentally false, universe. The film's concluding atmosphere, thick with unresolved tension, invites a final, piercing examination of legacy and implication. The narrative doesn't just end with the characters separated. It suggests that their toxic synergy has created a template for future engagements, a kind of emotional DNA that is difficult to purge. For the dominant figure, the aftermath is defined by a relentless search for replacement intensity, which often manifests as an ironic overcorrection in their professional life. They might become pathologically risk-averse in business dealings, terrified of relinquishing any shred of calculated control, having learned the devastating consequence of relinquishing it in the personal sphere. Their charisma, once a wild, untamed force, is now compressed into an air of severe, almost clinical efficiency, a cage built of their own making. The audience suspects that their greatest fear is not loneliness, but the quiet realization that their self was merely a composite sketch drawn in reaction to their partner's compliance. The submissive character's journey, while centered on self-reclamation, is never portrayed as entirely clean. The emotional landscape remains complex, seasoned with moments of stark clarity bordering on sorrow. They understand that the sheer power of the dynamic, however damaging, offered a strange form of significance, a life lived at a heightened frequency. Their new, stable existence, while morally superior, can sometimes feel emotionally muted by comparison. This nuance is captured in quiet moments of observation, watching a distant, turbulent storm, or overhearing a heated argument between strangers, where a fleeting shadow of recognition, a ghost of longing for that volatile proximity, passes across their face before being consciously dismissed. This flicker ensures the film avoids sentimentality. The journey back to self is recognized as an exchange, trading exhilarating intoxication for sustainable peace. The entire cinematic endeavor culminates in a powerful commentary on narrative authority. The film itself refuses the neat three-act resolution, because true psychological recovery defies easy scripting. By leaving the audience with the ambiguous tableau, the director transfers the responsibility of resolution to the viewer. We are left contemplating whether the dominant figure is capable of self-therapy or if they are doomed to perpetually reenact variations of the dynamic, and whether the survivor's peace is permanent or merely a carefully maintained truce. The enduring resonance is the understanding that some scars don't fade. They simply become integrated into the landscape of one's identity, forever marking the boundaries of acceptable intimacy and the profound, necessary labor of becoming whole alone. Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Parallel Reels channel. If you're new here, please consider hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like if you enjoy the content. Today, we are going to be discussing the drama film Pacarku Dominan Dan Liar. The narrative unfolds around a young woman whose life takes a sharp turn after encountering a man who embodies a raw, untamed masculinity. Initially drawn in by his magnetic presence, she finds herself navigating a relationship characterized by intense control and passionate unpredictability, echoing perhaps the very visceral, unfiltered emotions often explored in independent cinema, far removed from glossy mainstream productions. Her background suggests a quieter existence, perhaps one where expectations of conformity still held sway, making the sheer force of his personality all the more disruptive. He, on the other hand, seems to carry the weight of a demanding, perhaps artistic or high-pressure career, the kind that breeds a need for absolute authority in his personal sphere. One can imagine him working in a field where precision and dominance translate directly into success, be it in high finance or the cutthroat world of competitive sports management, an environment that cultivates a certain ruthlessness. The drama hinges on the erosion of her boundaries. What begins as exciting, a thrilling dance on the edge of propriety, slowly morphs into something suffocating. The film carefully details the subtle ways his dominance manifests, not always through overt aggression, but through manipulative subtleties, the constant need to be the center of her universe, dictating her choices, her associations, even her thoughts. This mirrors the often unspoken power dynamics seen in narratives where one partner possesses a more established or forceful public persona, leveraging that external success inward. There are moments of intense tenderness, brief respites where the mask of the controlling figure slips, revealing a vulnerability that both reassures her and keeps her deeply entangled. These flashes serve as the necessary emotional tether, ensuring she doesn't simply walk away, much like the subtle character development often required in dramas that delve into complex psychological attachments. The inspiration for his intensity might stem from a deeply ingrained fear of abandonment or failure, projecting that anxiety onto the need to control his partner absolutely. As the pressure mounts, her own nascent strength begins to push back, fueled by an awakening to her own identity, something perhaps long suppressed by the demands of the relationship. This internal struggle is portrayed through quiet acts of defiance, a postponed meeting, an unapproved conversation, small tremors preceding a significant shift. The resolution, when it finally arrives, is less about a clean break and more about a hard-won understanding of self, achieved only after surviving the crucible of an overwhelmingly dominant force. The lingering feeling is that while the intensity may have subsided, the imprint of that raw, wild relationship will forever inform how she views desire and control in her future. The texture of their interactions is relentlessly consuming. We see her initially mistaking his intensity for profound passion, a common misinterpretation when one is starved for genuine connection. He, perhaps a man whose professional life demands meticulous execution, maybe a leading architect known for monolithic, imposing structures, or a film director whose vision allows no deviation, brings that same rigid framework into their shared apartment. His control isn't just about where she goes, it's about the very atmosphere of their home, a space that slowly ceases to feel like hers. Her emotional landscape shifts from vibrant anticipation to constant low-grade anxiety. Imagine her once filled with aspirations. Perhaps she was a promising junior editor, or a dedicated teacher whose patience was her strength, now finding that patience constantly tested, redirected toward placating his moods. The film excels at showing these small degradations. A smile that falters when he enters the room, the habitual checking of her phone to ensure no message has escaped his notice, the way her voice softens unnaturally when addressing him. His allure, the reason she remains tethered, resides in the sheer force of his charisma when he chooses to deploy it. These moments are intoxicatingly powerful, reminiscent of a tempestuous sea suddenly calming to glass, offering breathtaking reflections before the next storm hits. This cyclical nature mirrors the addictive qualities often observed in high-stakes environments. The risk becomes part of the reward. When he praises her, it feels earned like a difficult promotion, a validation so potent that it outweighs the days spent feeling invisible under his scrutiny. There are subtle hints at his own internal landscape, maybe glimpsed during moments when he is deeply engrossed in his work. A fleeting expression of profound loneliness, or a strained jawline suggesting that his dominance is as much a defense mechanism as a preference. Perhaps his own rise to prominence was fraught with betrayal or perceived slights, leading him to believe that vulnerability is equivalent to surrender. This psychological underpinning adds necessary depth, preventing him from becoming a mere caricature of a strong man, grounding his behavior in a recognizable, albeit toxic, form of self-protection. The pivot point often involves an external catalyst, a friend who gently questions her choices, or perhaps a professional success of hers that he subtly undermines, viewing her independent achievement as a threat to his singular dominance. This external pressure forces her to confront the gap between the man she idealized and the man who dictates her reality. The ensuing confrontation is not necessarily loud. Often, in dramas of this psychological intensity, the most profound ruptures happen in silence, in the deliberate refusal to meet his gaze, in the quiet act of reclaiming a piece of her own schedule, a decision made purely for herself, without seeking his prior approval. It is in these small, resolute affirmations of self that the narrative finds its truest, most resonant strength. The emotional toll of this constrained existence begins to manifest physically in her. We observe a subtle tension in her shoulders, the perpetual slight hunch that speaks of bracing for an unseen impact. She might have once been known for her easy laughter, perhaps a reflection of a nurturing profession like a pediatric nurse or a teacher who specialized in fostering creativity, but that lightness has been replaced by a practiced neutrality, a shell worn to deflect scrutiny. Her clothing might subtly change, becoming less expressive, more muted, an unconscious attempt to blend into the background and avoid registering on his radar unnecessarily. He, the dominant figure, likely operates in a realm where perception is currency, a sought-after brand strategist, or a high-profile gallery owner whose reputation precedes him. His inspiration comes not just from success, but from imposing his worldview onto others. His passion, when directed at her, is frighteningly specific. He doesn't just want her to be with him, he wants to architect the very best version of her, according to his exacting, unshared blueprint. This is where the danger truly lies, in the seductive promise of perfection achieved through compliance. There is a scene, perhaps, where she attempts a small, independent venture, maybe starting an online portfolio for her latent photography skills or volunteering for a cause she deeply believes in. His reaction is never explosive rage, but something far more insidious. Professional dismissal veiled as concern. He might critique the structure of her website with surgical precision, or gently suggest the charity is too common, subtly draining the energy from her endeavor until it dissolves back into the comfortable void of non-confrontation. This intellectual dismantling is often more crippling than a shout. The moments where she recalls her previous life, her independent friendships, the easy confidence she held before him, are portrayed not with tearful regret, but with a quiet, steely resolve hardening behind her eyes. This transformation from passive subject to nascent revolutionary is the core of her arc. It's the realization that the intensity she initially craved was merely a mirror reflecting his own unmanaged internal chaos, and that true strength lies not in surviving his storms, but in choosing a stable, self-owned shore. The narrative emphasizes that reclaiming autonomy is a slow, painstaking process of small, deliberate acts of self-trust, a quiet rebellion waged entirely within the confines of her own will, leading ultimately to an independence that is earned through survival. The air around them is thick with unspoken rules, a climate she has learned to breathe only superficially. Her past life, perhaps one involving the structured yet rewarding world of pharmaceutical research, where meticulous attention to detail was paramount, now seems like a quaint, almost naive memory. She once navigated complex chemical interactions. Now, she navigates the volatile terrain of his moods. Her former colleagues might remember her for her quiet brilliance, a steady hand in the lab, traits that are now actively suppressed lest they suggest a competency that rivals his own. His career, whether in high-stakes corporate law or as a renowned conductor whose baton controls entire orchestras, instills in him a profound belief in hierarchy. For him, the world is divided into those who lead and those who follow, and he positions himself immovably at the apex of their personal structure. His inspiration seems drawn from a need to impose order on anything that seems too wild or unpredictable, a psychological compulsion that manifests as a need to curate her every facet, from the books she reads to the music she listens to, often replacing her familiar comforts with his own favored, more severe artistic tastes. The emotional texture of their shared life becomes increasingly one-sided. We see her developing a kind of hyper-vigilance, an internal clock ticking constantly against the possibility of transgression. She learns the nuances of his silence, a short, sharp silence indicating disapproval, a drawn-out, hollow silence signifying withdrawal of affection. This constant state of readiness drains her reserves, leaving her emotionally threadbare even when she manages to meet his immediate demands. It is the fatigue of perpetually acting in a role written for someone else. When tenderness surfaces, it is often heavily weighted with possessiveness. He might present her with an extravagant gift, a piece of jewelry or a spontaneous trip, but these gestures are always framed as affirmations of ownership rather than simple generosity. These moments are designed to flood her with gratitude, momentarily washing away the memory of the previous restrictive days, functioning as emotional currency to buy her continued compliance. The film subtly suggests that his inspiration for these displays comes from a deep-seated insecurity. Control is the only reliable mechanism he possesses to feel secure in a world he perceives as inherently chaotic. Her slow awakening is marked by her reclaiming small physical spaces and private moments. Perhaps she begins taking solitary walks in a direction he has not explicitly sanctioned, or she reserves a single drawer in a desk for letters she writes but never sends. These small sanctuaries of self are vital, representing the quiet revolution occurring within her. The narrative builds toward the realization that true partnership cannot be built on the foundation of one person's total submission. Her journey is defined by recognizing that her own inherent worth is not contingent upon his volatile approval. The eventual separation, or the establishment of new, hard-won boundaries, is depicted not as a sudden explosion, but as the slow, deliberate freezing over of a passionate, yet ultimately unsustainable fire. The film deepens its exploration as her self-reclamation forces him into a corner where his usual tools of manipulation begin to fail. When she stops anticipating his needs and starts prioritizing her own quiet